is by far the music capital of the world. Nearly every major musical genre, from jazz to punk and rap, blossomed into commercial and artistic success in our city. We also happen to be one of the global centers for illegal drug trafficking, with heroin at the top of the list. According to one fairly reliable estimate, about 200,000 New Yorkers regularly use heroin. So it's probably not surprising to learn that New York's music industry has had the heroin monkey on its back almost from the start. Some of the city's most well-known musicians have admitted to an addiction, and a number have died from it. That raises an uncomfortable truth. These artists have brought glory to our city and given us special enjoyment. But we've closed our eyes to the dark side of their careers, or maybe worse, just winked at their drug use as an occupational hazard. The 60s, after all, gave birth to the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But how serious is the connection between heroin and music in New York City? What do the artists themselves tell us? Barry Spunt, a professor at John Jay College, has written a book exploring these questions. It's called Heroin and Music in New York City, and it's a disturbing read. Professor Spunt joins us today on Criminal Justice Matters to tell us what he found. Barry, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you. So the first question I have to ask you is, what got you into this book? Why did you start it?
Well, my field is drug research, and I've been doing it in New York for over 30 years. And most of my work has to do with heroin. And a few years back, I had this idea of writing a social history of heroin in New York City. The model would have been Howard Zinn, who wrote a sort of a personal history of the U.S. So I wanted to get a history of heroin in New York City, which basically would have started around 1900 when heroin first came out and hit the streets. So I wanted to look at heroin from the user's perspective, from the dealer's perspective, from the criminal justice responder's perspective, from the treatment perspective, have them talking as to be the part of the history, to be the history. So I started working on that for, about 2-3 years, and I came to realize I'm all over the place. There's just way too much here, okay? This is gonna take me forever. So I figured, let me get a little slice of the heroin users in New York. And I chose music, because it's no secret that all sorts of users, all sorts of musicians who play different types of music based in New York have been self-acknowledged, heroin users. And I wasn't interested in people who experimented or dipped and dabbed, and I wasn't interested in trying to get a whole life history of a musician's drug use. That'd be impossible. And I had certain music genres I needed to cover, so that's how I got into it.
So some of the names that you book covers,
Yeah.
Iggy Pop,
Yeah.
Debbie Harry of Blondie, John Lennon. These are icons in the music business,
Yes.
which maybe they sang a little bit about drugs or heroin addiction, but to think that all these people had these addiction problems is just nothing short of astonishing, or disturbing, I guess you can call
Well,
it in some way.
they didn't all have, they weren't all abusers for particularly long periods of their lives, okay? John Lennon was a user for sort of a short period of time before he came to New York, and a little bit after he came to New York, and he counted in the book because, obviously he's from England, but he, last 10 years of his life, he lived in New York, so he counted. Iggy Pop was a guy about our age and hasn't used in probably 30 years. But when he was a kid, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, he was a user.
But who knew that heroin, as such, was such an essential part of what they were doing, their music?
Well,
Did they see it that way, or is it something that we now look at and say, "My God, this is"?
No, journalists have written quite a bit about heroin use by musicians. Music journalists in particular, and there's all sorts of information you can find on the web and around heroin use by musicians. But sociology really hadn't taken much of a look at it. In fact, the last study I found that was anything close to what I did was a study in the 50s. Charlie Winnick did a study of jazz musicians and did interviews with some of those jazz musicians. So for a lot of reasons, it was an open field. I felt I could make a contribution to drug research. I mean, that's what I am. I'm a drug
So
researcher.
just to be clear, you did not speak to any individual musicians.
No,
you took a sample.
Yeah, what I did
These were
was
indirect.
I made a decision, like an executive decision, early on, not to try to do interviews. I mean, my whole life as a researcher, that's all I did was interviews. You go out there, get the interview, get the good story, get the juicy account. But I chose here not to do that for some, really good reasons. Number one, of the 69 people in the sample spread around the different music genres, I mean, a lot of them are dead. Either they died of an OD,
Yes.
or they just died of a heroin-related thing, or they just died, a few years ago, or like, for instance, bebop jazz folks. A lot of those guys aren't around, whether it was because of heroin or just old age. I couldn't interview them. I figured a lot of the people in the sample would be reluctant to talk about heroin. Heroin isn't something that, hey, sure, let's, I'll tell you all about my heroin use. It's a very private, kind of thing. And also, I figured they'd be hard to get. And the main thing was those who were alive. I mean, why would Iggy Pop want to talk to me about something he hasn't done for 30 years? It's heavily documented in a whole bunch of books that he's talked about his heroin use. So I decided not to do interviews. I went straight for all the secondary sources, the books, the articles, the websites, the blogs, a lot of which I found up at the Library for Performing Arts up in Lincoln Center, which is a gold mine of stuff that...
Well, some of these guys might not have wanted to talk about it, but we can assume that if it happened to them 10, 20, 30 years ago from a whole range of genres and a whole range of, from R&B all the way up to rap, then it must still be happening now. And it's kind of a cautionary tale, wouldn't it be, for the newer musicians to say, well, look, this is what happened to these guys. You're going to be dealing with the same thing.
The newer guys, like in folk and in jazz, they know what happened to those guys. They came from a different area.
But it doesn't make a difference.
Well, yeah. I mean, they saw what heroin had done to these old-time beboppers or these old-time punk rockers. And the times are different. In the book, I talk a lot about how subculture is important and how identity is important. And heroin use isn't just some personal pathology. And among current musicians in different genres, a subculture which lauds heroin, which encourages heroin, which sees heroin as a good thing to do. And I mean, that kind of mindset, those values don't exist anymore.
Right.
So for a lot of folks, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of musicians nowadays who use, but if I couldn't find them talking about it publicly, then where am I going to get the information? So I'm sure I missed a lot of folks who did use.
What's fascinating to me in your book was what the artists themselves said about their drug use, about their heroin use. I want to quote, and you have a number of fantastic quotes in the book itself, but here's John Lennon talking about his experience with heroin in 1970, which you quote. And he said, "It was just not too much fun. I never injected it or anything. We sniffed a little when we were in real pain, but we got such a hard time from everyone, and I've had so much thrown at me and at Yoko, especially at Yoko. We took heroin because of what the Beatles and others were doing to us, but we got out of it." So it's an escape. It's a way to get away from the pressures of stardom, and also, I guess, of inner band pressures. That seems to run through a lot of the motivation for the guys and people who are using it.
The musicians, I mean, by and large, they used heroin for the same reasons other people use heroin, but also for reasons particular to the music industry. One, you just mentioned, the pressure of being in the Beatles and the tension between the Beatles. But it's also the issue of things like becoming a millionaire at age 20 and the stresses around that. A guy like James Taylor talked about that, how difficult it was. a guy like Dion from Dion and the Belmonts, wasn't easy for these guys. All of a sudden, you're a big superstar. You're 20 years old, and I
But
guess
some of
it ain't
them-
easy.
You do make the point, I think, in some places that some of them did start heroin use when they were kids, when they were
Oh,
young.
yeah.
Before they, Steve Earle, for instance,
Yeah.
grew up in Texas,
Right.
was turned on by his uncle.
Yeah, when he was like a teenager.
So you wonder a little bit how much their drug use contributed to their actual musicality, to their musical genius, so to speak,
Well, I mean,
to their creativity. People have talked about the link between drugs and creativity since Confessions of an Opium Eater in the 19th
yeah,
century.
well, I mean, that was part of the three main foci of the book, the three main questions were why the folks started to use in the first place, okay? How it affected their playing and their creativity and their performance, and also why was it that heroin was more common in some music subcultures than in others. And you have a whole bunch of different stories. Some started before they became musicians, some started after. There was a lot of similarity with average folks who used. There were some differences between musicians and common folks who use. So you had a whole grab bag of stories. In terms of creativity, I mean, they just didn't do a whole lot for the creativity. The most I got out of it was, in some cases, heroin blocked out inner noise, okay, which helps a musician. I think Charlie Parker described it that way. And some musicians talked about how it gave them confidence to go on stage, how it enabled them to practice longer hours, how it, those kinds of things.
But they all do make the point, or most of them make the point anyway, that overall heroin was not a positive
Oh, yeah.
for their careers, for their art.
You
for
had
their
to
creativity.
stretch in what they said to find anything positive about it. And then, not just performance and careers, but all the health problems they had, and the ODing and the financial problems, and they're constantly being harassed by the police, and they're doing what Miles Davis called junkie shit on stage. They're, nodding out and getting late for the performance. So what happens? They get bad reputations, they lose jobs, they miss opportunities, they get fired. No, there wasn't a whole lot that...
Here's Keith Richards. I did get to a point where the music was secondary. I was devoting most of my time to scoring and taking dope. I was completely out of it, and Mick had to cover for me. He took over completely. I managed to make gigs and write some songs, but Mick took care of everything through the 70s.
Now, 2 points about that. Somebody might ask, well, gee, Barry, it's about a book. It's a book about New York City. What are you including him for? Well, the fact is that he's lived in the New York area for over 35 years, so he's in there. And he also said that if you know the Stones' music, albums like Exile on Main Street, which was a double album, the guy was totally stoned doing that. So it doesn't eliminate creativity, but it just, in most cases, doesn't do a whole lot for it. A lot of bebop jazz musicians, when they were coming up, they wanted to use heroin because they wanted to play like Charlie Parker. And they knew that Charlie Parker used heroin, and they figured, well, maybe...
So there was a celebrity glamour
S-
about it.
So maybe
Celebrity.
if I used heroin, I'd be great as Charlie Parker
The
too,
ultimate-
but rarely did it ever work out like that.
The ultimate celebrity drug.
Yeah. Heroin is, to me, it's always been sort of on the drug ladder, the pinnacle, the top of the ladder of, drug ugliness, okay? And the most demonized drug. That's why I focused on heroin.
So it was a form of rebellion. If you took it, you were rebelling against straight society.
Well, certainly for bebop jazz musicians, there was a strong element to that. Certainly for punk rockers who used heroin. Now, for punks, heroin wasn't their favorite drug, speed was, but a lot of punks used heroin.
And
for
Richard
sure.
Hell, I think, was one of the...
Yeah, and sure. And Sid Vicious, it was a book about heroin in New York City, so even though he had, Sid wasn't from New York, I mean, the last couple of years of his life, he died. He was here, and he famously, killed Nancy in the Chelsea Hotel, which,
When he was-
by the way, he didn't do that. And I wasn't there, and I can't tell you exactly who did it, but I can tell you for sure it wasn't him. But that story had to go into the book, even though he's
So
not.
the New York part of it,
Yeah.
specifically New York part of it, are the venues where a lot of this happened. So a lot of the venues, whether it's CBGB's of the 70s and 80s, or the Harlem jazz clubs, which were kind of hangouts for users, for dealers, and for musicians. How much did the actual venue itself, or the mystique, or the glamour of those venues contribute to accelerated heroin use?
No, if you get to play at one of those famous, if you're a black guy and you come to New York like Miles Davis, who's not from New York, and you get to play at some of those uptown clubs, and you get to hang out with people like Charlie Parker. I mean, it's a huge push. It's really, really glamorous. If you're a punk rocker and you get to open for the Ramones, or play down at CBGB's or something, it's a big thrill. I mean, those were the sights.
Were those areas where they were selling as well and dealing as well as just using? I mean, were they centers for actual trafficking? Do you know?
That I can't tell you. I mean, I wasn't around alive or in New York when those uptown jazz clubs were around, like in the 30s and 40s. And CBGB's, I mean, I went there as a patron a couple of times, and I can't tell you exactly what went on, but I can tell you at places like if you think of another music genre, you think of dance music, electronic dance music, which was the sort of the son or the daughter of disco. In the 90s, you had all those places with the Club Kids and those famous clubs, the Palladium and the Limelight. Those were noted centers of drug dealing. I mean, you could get stoned beforehand, you could buy drugs right there. It wasn't all heroin. I mean, if you're going out for a night of dancing, I mean, heroin probably isn't the drug you want to be using, but you'd be surprised. A lot of the top 2 disco DJs in New York during the disco era were both hardcore junkies, Larry Levin and Nicky Siano. So it wasn't so much the people who went dancing, but there's heroin throughout those music genres, even rap music. I couldn't find any rappers who shoot dope, but still the image of the heroin dealer on the street is so prominent in a lot of the songs of especially the gangster rappers. So even though they might not use, they hold the drug in a certain esteem, for sure.
I want to get back to the glamour in just a second, but the other thing that we should mention, this is the Criminal Justice Discussion Show.
Yeah.
We're talking about a criminal activity, but
Right.
in none of the interviews that you quote or cite, or even the songs, is there much of a discussion about the illegality, the fear of cops coming down on the fear of DA even. I mean, is that purposeful? Do they just not think about it, or is it because if you're a musician, you're in this cocoon that you think you're immune to getting busted?
Actually, I'd say generally that's right, but I mean, there's also the case of jazz musicians, black guys in the 40s who were, Billie Holiday, constantly being harassed and set up by the police. In fact, in the days before you had treatment networks in New York like you have now, if you're a heroin user and you got busted in New York in the 40s, you were sent to a public health hospital like down in Kentucky. And they had a great jazz bands down there because all the jazz musicians up here who got busted, they went down to Lexington and they formed a wonderful jazz band because they were all players, So it's not the case that they weren't concerned about the police, and it was especially the case that the black jazz people took the worst hit, for sure. Yeah.
The point about the glamour is something interesting that certainly the 40s and 50s, the Rat Pack era, the Sinatra, when alcohol was the drug of choice, or the popular drug of choice, and there was something mystique and glamorous about being stoned on alcohol all the time. and that added a bit of glamour to it. I mean, not that people who listened to them walked around and got, drank a lot of whiskey purposely to be like Frank Sinatra, but there was a sense that these guys lived in this wonderful, glamorous world with fumes of alcohol surrounding them. It was the same sort of glamour attached in the '60s and '70s to dope.
Well, yeah, there was, because, I mean, a lot of street research done in New York with heroin abusers before my time, but in the '60s and '70s, heroin was seen as the king of drugs, okay? You could have a very desired self-image and identity if you used that drug. You were a cool person. You could assert and realize a sort of a tough street sense. You were the ultimate in the coolness of if you shot dope. So there certainly was a lot of that generally in the population, and I would guess a certain amount also among musicians for sure. So that's where the glamour comes in. Okay?
There certainly wasn't an effort on the part of the artists themselves, except for a few of them that I can remember, would say to their young admirers and listeners, "Don't do this. Don't take drugs. This is where it's going to get you." There was none of that sort of preacher.
Oh no, the hardcore ones, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, at least in terms of jazz. Don't do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Don't do it. It ain't good. But people saw how they played.
Do what I say, don't do what I do.
Exactly. They saw how he played. They saw how she sang, and gee, maybe if I can be like them too.
Did we help them along in any way by admiring their work and sort of making the synergy between their work itself and their creativity and the drugs they used, even though they themselves admitted it didn't really much help their music? But did we help this along by thinking, wow, these are fantastic and they're stoned and they're just great musicians, and the more they do it, the more we egg them on, and they just say, this is our life?
I don't think so. I think it was more likely we, the policies we've had and we continue to have around drug issues did, more damage to their lives. I mean, rather than, a guy gets busted for using heroin or caught with a package of heroin, I mean, send him to prison, send him to Rikers, or send him to Lexington, Kentucky. I mean, that ain't helping them at all, And if you'd like me to say a few comments about how things are nowadays in terms of heroin and the war on drugs, because it's all relevant. I mean, you can't. Nobody's going to not use heroin because they might get busted. Okay. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is heroin is so easy to get. It's just as cheap, if not cheaper, than it used to be in the old days. It's much, much purer. That $10 bag you get up the street, which we could find in 20 minutes, has maybe a 50 or 60% purity versus a bag 20 years ago that had 5% purity. So that everybody realizes that the war on drugs has pretty much been a failure. And people realize that when the police are going after people, they're not going after small fries, they're going after the big, cartels. And I don't know too many people who don't use drugs, or even a drug like heroin, just because they might get arrested. I mean, there's lots of good reasons not to use heroin, for sure. But, I might get arrested isn't probably one of the top ones.
The link between drugs, any kind of drugs, but psychotropic drugs, psychedelic drugs, heroin, and creativity is always a fascinating one. It's been a fascinating one since the Opium Eaters by Thomas De Quincey, but nobody has quite got a handle on that.
Well, there are one book out, a couple books out in recent years. One book called Heroin and Genius. Okay, and I have a copy in my office I can get you. And he's more of a journalist, I forget the author's name, but he looked through all different drugs, all through history, not just heroin. And again, he comes to the same conclusion. By and large, heroin and these other drugs don't do a whole lot for creativity, except perhaps, in the short term a little bit. If you if a drug makes you practice harder, and you finally get that riff down, it'll improve the song a little bit. But in the overall scheme of things, you're not going to get any more creative by using heroin, and heroin just ain't going to do you a whole lot of good. And kids, stay away, okay? I mean, heroin's a drug. You know, despite what you hear, and despite the fact that, oh, you don't have to get addicted, and oh, you can use it occasionally, and it's not automatically, you don't want to mess with it because it'll bring you down.
It's a sobering note to go out on. Barry, thanks so much for being with us. We could certainly keep talking about this for a while.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Okay.
A lot of the artists we've talked about today form part of the soundtrack of my own life. That's probably true for many of you as well. So learning about what their habit cost them in terms of their own lives is both sad and troubling. Were we enablers to their addiction? Does it hold any lessons for today's up-and-coming artists? Let me know what you think. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next month.
I'm working now on a follow-up book about film and comedy, okay, with the same methodology, same ideas about subculture and identity. So I have a sample of New York-based actors who are self-acknowledged heroin abusers. I just finished a chapter on 11 New York-based comedians who are self-acknowledged heroin users. And I'm exploring the same Lenny Bruce, starting with Lenny Bruce. And then, you know, if I live long enough, I'll have a third book, Heroin and Literature, because there's so much literature in New York City that it has a heroin focus on it.